how do we ensure that these very promising legislative reforms don't create a sort of form over function scenario where on the books institutions appear legitimate, but they're not performing core functions as Ricardo said.
Thank you. But it's a big challenge. I completely agree with the diagnosis. When you look at other international cases, such as Brazil, such as Guatemala, you'll see that in the Mexican case, society did not mobilize against an actor, a single actor. They didn't ask for the dismissal of the president or for the imprisonment of singular people. They ask for institutional changes. You might say you are so conservative. Your civil society is so conservative. You don't react the way you should have. But it was interesting to see that there is a little hope about how these institutions are going to work. We also have a problem because we have to manage expectations. The movement where we participated had these two stages. The first stage focused on the constitutional reform, and the second stage, and the first stage was only interaction between civil society organizations, some of them, and our accountability champions. That is, senators that were engaged on this cause and made legislation happen. But the second stage, taking advantage of the proposal that made these two organizations, IMCO and Mexican Transparency, was for getting a single legislation that is the law called 3 of 3, talking about these declarations, public asset declaration, and etc. But it contained more than that. It contained a huge redesign of the responsibility system, with the typification of concrete corruption acts, taking as a definition of corruption the classical definition of the use of power for private gain. So the expectations that we generated were that with this legislation and this new system, corruption was going to end. And it's not true. We were on the streets taking these signatures because we had to collect 120,000 signatures, and at the end we had 650,000 signatures. And people went to sign, and they told us, where do I sign? I want all the corrupt people in jail, and I want that guy to get punished. And I was, well, no, hold on. the initiative doesn't say that. The initiative is about building a new system. No, I want to sign. I want to do something against the corrupt people. So we have, yes, we have to manage expectations. So what do? I think we have short-term challenges, such as ending the route of harmonization of the laws. Mexico is a very complex country. It has 32 states with huge differences between one state and another. We have the southern states, such as Oaxaca, such as Chiapas. For citing an example, in Chiapas, 74% of the people are in poverty. And Nuevo León, at the northern part, the states of the northern part of the country are more wealth. They have more wealth, such as Nuevo León, when the poverty rate is only 20% of the people. So in this complex society, we have to finish with the normative building. And once the normative building is finished, we have to start making capacity building on the new institutions. It's a new system where you have to make budget happen. You have to guarantee certain autonomy of action to avoid political capture of people that is going to intervene in this system. And we created what we thought was a counterbalance institution that is called the Citizen Committee, to link civil society organizations and public participation on the fighting against corruption, and it's going to be part of the new system. So I will say autonomy, meritocracy, budget, and building capacity at the short term.
Thank you, Lourdes. Marco, if you could, answering Ricardo and building on Lourdes's point, the laws are on the books, and Lourdes talked about budget and about the challenges of implementation. How do we make this real in terms of actual performance of these agencies, and how does that actually deliver for the everyday average Mexican?
I mean, I think that is the key question. I think from my perspective, even the people that work in scholar terms in this area still are far away of having a satisfactory answer. I mean, if we, for example, see the recent book by Alina Mungiu PPD, for example, okay, the way that other countries have moved little by little to better development outcomes. I mean, it's a series of factors that, and some even very historical factors in terms of wars, for example, that force countries to have more professional bureaucracies. I'm in the middle of working in a research project that has the goal of having a better scholar understanding of this phenomenon, but particularly concerned precisely with the policy implications of how do we move forward. What we have learned, for example, of other countries is that in order to little by little move in the direction of the coalition of the good, okay, rather than the coalition of just focusing on the evil, I mean, one key aspect is a free press, because it increases the political cost of corrupt practices. And in Mexico, we have a huge challenge, because although we have a better press compared to what we had 20 years ago, for example, we are far away of having good investigative journalism. Why? Because many of the media are themselves involving conflict of interest, because they are dependent on high levels of revenue through government publicity. The other problem that we have is the money in electoral politics and the patrimonialism, the patronage and clientelistic practice that undermine the capacity of really little by little building intelligence in the institutions. Because every party comes, brings along their people, appointed through partisan or personal relationships rather than on merit. And under those circumstances, it's impossible to develop the investigative, for example, capacities to little by little bringing people into justice and send the signals, the incentives that impunity is reducing, and therefore the probability of you committed a crime, not only corruption, but any kind of crime, you have to be thinking twice because you have a high probability of being caught. That, clearly, we are far away of achieving that. I mean, as a member of the persons that were involved in the discussions with Congress, all the time I had on the back of my mind that we didn't have to be naive, thinking that things were going to change with changes in the laws. But the real problem was going to see how are we going to transform the institutions to little by little create these capacities that Pritchett and others have been working on. I mean, how do you develop those capacities? How do you introduce really meritocracy, for example, into the civil service? When I was conducting a series of interviews last year with members, for example, of the Justice Department, I was like pushing them, say, okay, obviously they try to twist your arm in many of the investigations against corruption here in the U.S. And the officials were saying, yes, but there is a difference. We are civil servants. We have professional civil service. So I mean, we have certain protection. If they're still trying to push us in the direction of trying to, for example, omit investigations of corruption, we can always walk the street and go to the Washington Post, leak the information, huge scandal takes place, and then all the political machine activates, so people have to be thinking twice in order to try to push, for example, the FBI or other agencies involved in corruption, in the investigation of corruption cases, to look the other way around. In Mexico, we are far away of achieving this kind of behavior.
Right.
And precisely, for me, the question is, okay, we are observing signals. For example, the colleagues of Animal Politico, this new network of journalists that use the social media very effectively to conduct good investigations of corruption. Precisely, the leading investigation that made public all the embezzlement practices of the governor in Veracruz was conducted by Animal Politico. And that increased the political cost in such a way that basically the governor was forced to take a leave of absence. And unfortunately, I mean, right now, he ran away, he's on the run. I mean, and we are putting a lot of pressure on the authorities that really do the investigation and bring him to justice. Right. So in that sense, little by little, we're far away of reaching this state with the capacity to really enforce the rule of law. I agree with you completely. That has to be the goal. Otherwise, I mean, obviously, the possibility of enforcing the rule of law in Mexico is going to be very little.
Right. And just for the audience's information, if you're not familiar, recently the governor of De La Cruz stepped down in the wake of these accusations a few weeks before election, and then an arrest warrant was issued, and they're currently searching for him to address these allegations. Ricardo, any responses to these responses?
No, well, I really am very impressed at the progress that civil society in Mexico is doing, because the standard thing it's the intuitive thing in Latin America is that when you face a problem, you want to write a law. Right, sort of like, oh, there's a problem. What law should I pass? Right, it's not a very intuitive thing in the U.S. as sort of like the solution is a change in the law. There's this joke that says that when traffic accidents started to happen in the U.S., the Kennedy School invented speed limits, and MIT invented the safety belt. So some of these things might be impacted by technology. There's these cases where policemen were paid in cash, and suddenly they moved to pay them in electronic money. And suddenly the policemen saw an increase of 35% in their salary. Nobody had increased their salary. It's just that the person who was giving them the cash was no longer in the take. Right? So sometimes changes happen through society. For example, the International Civil Society created this extractive industry transparency initiative, not to have governments enact laws or anything, but to force the companies to make public the taxes that they had paid, so that and so you acted internationally on the agents of the other side of corruption, not on the ability of the state to enforce its rules. The things you mentioned about just reputation, there is no law. I mean, there might be a law against groping women, but
sure there is. Here there is.
but this issue of groping women is having consequences outside of the law. It's having consequences because of people's attitudes towards certain behaviors and people's political response to certain behaviors. So we unfortunately did, not unfortunately, we fortunately did a research with really disappointing findings. In India, the Evidence for Policy Design, which is one of the programs at CIDE, studied what was the consequences of informing voters in India about the corruption history of candidates. And the answer was nothing.
Wow.
So it's also a bit cultural in the sense of, what's your impression of what you expect from your leaders, what is accepted behavior. Because if laws are sort of like very legalese and not founded as an expression of shared moral values, people will find them sort of like of arbitrary imposition rather than of expected imposition, even if without enforcement, right? Because it's part of like the moral code, not the legal code.
I think you make a very interesting point there. In the study of criminal justice and criminology and in sociology, we often talk about the study of formal social control through the administration of laws, prosecution, arrests, incarcerations, and the informal social control. 90-95% of all social control is informal. Why do we not light up a cigarette in this conference room? There's no police officer here to enforce that. Interestingly, generally speaking, there's a lot of people who study informal social control, and there's a lot of people who study formal social control. They don't often talk to one another. And in fact, I think in some ways, a lot of this discussion of corruption and legitimacy is about the interrelationship between formal and informal social control. And can you create a virtuous circle where one is reinforcing the other, or do you have a vicious cycle where one is undermining the other?
There's President, this is a phrase that attributed to many people, but I've always heard it to be attributed to President the one before the revolution. Porfirio Diaz. Porfirio Diaz, who said, in a loose translation in English, for my friends, everything. Yeah. For my enemies, the law.
Juárez.
That was Juárez. So it's everybody gets attributed. But I thought Juárez was a hero. Yes. But for my friends, anything. For my enemies, the law. So the law is not something that expresses our good. It's something with which you punish your political enemy. So it's a rule of law. I mean, Fukuyama makes an interesting point that the really important part of rule of law is not the capacity of the state to impose the laws on the citizen, but the capacity of the law to be imposed on the state itself, on constraining state behavior, right? And in that sense, at the core of all these rules and these constitutional things is what is the capacity to control the state itself.
Right. So just I want to just change the subject ever so slightly. We haven't actually talked about the concrete impacts that corruption can have on growth, on development, and so I'd just like first Lourdes and then Marco and Ricardo. Maybe you can follow up more generally. What are the concrete ways in which the inability to rein in corruption or to improve the performance of these organizations, how is this hurting Mexico? So if you could answer that.
Thanks a lot. Well, in many ways, some researchers talk about the effects of corruption and the cost of corruption. I don't really agree on the way they measure this cost, because they talk about 10 points of the GDP. And I wonder how these calculations are made. But what we know, the evidence shows that corruption has an effect on investment, on public trust, on fundamental rights, such as access to health services, educational services, and that is very well documented. It affects society in all levels, even relationship between citizenships, trust between one another. We have a recent report called The Quality of Citizenship in Mexico, and results are terrible because we always talk about an ideal citizen, the ideal citizen that gets informed, that wants their representatives accountable, the ideal citizens that knows his rights and demands that these rights are accomplished, but the reality is another one. So one of the concrete effects about corruption, I'll say, is not only at the economic level, but also at the social level and the cultural level.
Marco?
I think that is a provocative question, because clearly there is a huge debate in the research community on how to really identify the effects of corruption over growth and eventually over development. From my point of view, I mean, many of the effects are indirect, in the sense that it undermines, for example, the possibility of having good quality of education. If there is a lot of corruption, I mean, it's impossible to, inside the public education system, it is very hard to have good teachers, for example, because many are appointed through corrupt practices. In many of our countries in Latin America, that's the other area of work that I do, and we have extensive evidence of unfortunate practices of corruption through the teachers' unions. You observe the indirect effect through bad health outcomes. When you observe, for example, higher prices of medicines, or the absence of medicines, because despite higher budgets toward the health system, suddenly the things are not there, and you begin to observe negative consequences in the health opportunities of people. So through those kind of channels, you observe a negative relationship with toward development. I agree. I mean, there is a huge literature on that. I tend to agree more on the side of how it undermines the trust toward political institutions. I mean, you observe like a correlation. Maybe it's not a causation, but you can see clearly that societies with high levels of corruption have low levels of trust toward political institutions, no? So clearly that also undermines the health of democratic regimes when corruption and the incapacity of the state to enforce the rule of law. So that is the way that I see it. I am aware of all the criticisms that, for example, Mauro and others have received in terms of the effects of corruption on growth. But, I mean, precisely learning, for example, from the literature on political regimes and growth, I tend to agree with these indirect effects that some have found precisely of democracy on growth through precisely the construction of trust and everything that I just forgot the name of this professor in Boston University that works on these issues, but I mean there are several scholars that have been working on that area. I think that a similar kind of story is the one associated on the effects of corruption and development.
Ricardo.
Well, you know, research and advocacy always fight over answers to this question, because the advocates want a number where they can say that promotes their cause. The researchers are a little bit more careful because we don't know what you mean by corruption, we don't know how to measure corruption, etc. But in a project we're doing in Sri Lanka, I learned a word I didn't know before, and the word is speed money. And the Sri Lankans make a distinction between corruption and speed money. So speed money is what you give a government official to do for you what he's supposed to do. And in some sense, people might feel a little bit wronged by an official asking for money for the things he was supposed to do for free. But they don't find it morally condemnable on the public. Now, if you ask me, what would
essentially to expedite whatever the process, the government process is.
Exactly.
I see.
Exactly. So
Speed money.
You might think, well, it's corruption, so let's attack the payment of speed money. You may end up in a worse world because now the only reason why the guys do something is because they get a little bit of a kickback on the side. So if you really control speed money, you may get a worse government. So we're doing a project in Panama where we think that Panama would benefit enormously from immigration, and they have very restrictive immigration policies. But thank God they're very poorly enforced, and there are all sorts of ways in which you can get around it. So you'd say, do I want really the government to enforce well a really bad law? So more importantly, I try to do some econometrics on this. And we have these World Bank indices of state capability and World Bank indices on control of corruption. And so I asked myself, so is it the capable state? Is it the corruption? What's the story? So I don't believe too much any of these numbers or any of these results, but I think that the result I came out was I think intuitive to me. It just so happens that if state capability seems to be more correlated with growth than control of corruption. They're both kind of like positively correlated with income. Rich countries do better of both. Poor countries do worse of both. But if you improve your control of corruption and you don't improve your state capability, you get a negative effect on growth. So this suggests that really the control of corruption is going to have a positive effect if it enhances state capability. That in the end, if you say, if I keep state capability constant and I just lower corruption, so it's a control of corruption that does not translate into the government doing anything better, then it actually, you pay the cost of reducing corruption and you get none of the benefits. That's my interpretation of the data.
You've triggered a response from Marco. So
yes, I just no. I mean, I really want to ask because I have been reading this literature, and sincerely, I don't have myself a good answer. If it's possible to achieve the control of corruption, if you don't have state capacity, I mean, because they go hand in hand. Once that you develop state capacity, then it's much more likely that you begin to control or to fight core corruption. I mean, otherwise, I cannot imagine, maybe there is, but I cannot imagine a scenario in which a country is capable of curbing corruption without really improving the way that the state has the capacity to enforce the rule of law. So I don't know. I mean, it's a question in that regard.
you've now triggered Ricardo. Back to Ricardo.
So I can imagine the following situation. People are concerned with government, corruption in government procurement. So they create these impossible procurement rules, and you shut down government. No one can do anything because it takes forever to contract anything. I remember a case in Liberia where the World Bank was demanding on all its procurement that you get 3 bids, and they were bids for crushed stone. And there was only one crushed stone producer in the whole nation, so they couldn't approve the project. And so I can't imagine situations in which you all these, because these rules to try to control corruption come at a certain cost, right? So you can imagine the cost being significant, and in particular, many people find many of the attractions of these public-private partnerships is because in the private sector they can contract things more easily and do things more than in the public sector that is that is so constrained in what it can do. So there might be a cost. I mean, the control of corruption may come at a cost in efficiency.
Yeah. Lourdes.
I agree with that because an excess of control can make bureaucracy very ineffective.
And even more corrupt.
And more corrupt. And what kind of message are we giving also to public officials? We want the best ones to be there. So this legislation, these changes have to be accompanied by state capacity and institutional capacity. If not, we are not going to have the best ones there, because the best ones are not going to be are not wanting to be a public official.
That may be, for the purposes of this discussion, the easiest way to reconcile it, which is that the issues of productivity and corruption shouldn't be considered in isolation, and that we should actually be considering them in relationship to one another much more. It seems to me that this discussion so far, and some of the legislative efforts that we've been discussing, are very much top-down. They're at least initially concerned with the actions of officials in high office. But as we know, in addition to corruption and impunity at the highest levels, we also have everyday corruption and impunity. In Mexico and in many other countries in Latin America, 90 to 95% of murderers, everyday murderers, are never prosecuted. What's the relationship between impunity, attacking impunity from the top, and attacking it from the bottom? Do you have to start in one place or the other? Do we have to do both at the same time? What are the relationships? Who'd like to take that first? Marco.
I mean, I think that on the one hand, it's not that you start in one part and on the other. I mean, you have been a government official yourself, and you have been a minister. I cannot imagine a scenario in which a government says, well, we have these things and we just work on one part and do not work on the other. Okay? So in that sense, it's a huge challenge because you are forced to see how to tackle the problem from both sides. I think that one of the keys on the top down, I really believe in the demonstration effect. And what do I mean by that? Recently, as part of this series of scandals that we were talking, in Mexico last year, the former commissioner of the water federal supply, he was running late for his vacation, so he decided that he could take the helicopter of the agency for a lift to the airport. Okay, so fortunately for Mexico's, the neighbor caught that on the phone, and the video got viral immediately. The discussion began viral. It began to increase that discussion immediately. He was forced to resign. But, I mean, in that sense, I mean, the fact that this guy thinks that is part of the entitlement of being a public servant. Natural to use the helicopter for a ride. I mean, creates a demonstration effect in the sense of the low-level bureaucrat in the commission water. How do you say to him, don't be a corrupt official? If the big boss behaves in that way. If the president, he thinks of our country, thinks that the conflict of interest in which he incurs is just a perception problem, and that corruption is a cultural thing. It is not a matter of that the institutions are not working. It's a matter of the culture. Then do you really believe that he has the moral authority, the political leadership to send the signal, and he can be believed that we need to move forward in a fight against corruption? Sincerely, I doubt it. So, of course, that the problem of corruption doesn't finish if you tackle only on the top. I mean, the normal citizen is concerned that if he's pulled over, there's no a relationship of corruption over there. That, by the way, we have also to accept that many times is the citizen himself that provokes the act of corruption. It's not the official demanding the bribe, but the citizen offering it. So at the same time that you're trying to tackle, I mean, and it's part of the purpose of this legislation to begin like creating the demonstration effect on the top of the government officials that precisely we were talking in the launch about this legislation in the penal code. Now, fortunately, in the struggles on the negotiations with legislators, we achieve that in the penal code, as it is in the U.S., it is a matter of more years of punishment toward a government official that incurs in a corrupt practice than a member of the private sector, precisely mimicking what is the concept here in the U.S. of public trust, of a government official that incurs in corruption betrays public trust, right, and therefore has to be punished more severely in comparison to the normal citizen.
Right. Responses from Lourdes, Ricardo, and then we'll get to questions.
Thank you. Yes, the problem is that there are some temptations on this bottom-up and top-down measures. The temptations are, for instance, the temptation what we call the capture of the big fish. You know? Big fish, people that are very visible, and you want some consequences against corruption acts, is not going to finish corruption, because it has been proven that corruption usually happens in networks. It's not a question of only individuals, but a whole network of people participating on that. So how do you dismantle this network? For example, the case that you talk about of the governor of Veracruz. The governor of Veracruz, he had the approval of the Congress to leave the state before finishing his period. And all the houses that he bought, he did it with the names of some public officials. So you have the temptation of how long does it going to take to make the outcomes of these institutional reforms? Is society going to wait that long to trust on the new institutional framework? Is society going to still demand for institutional changes, or is it going to go on another way, or are you going to ask for other things, such as the Brazilian case or the Guatemalan case? So there is a tension that is very present, and I think that the challenge is very huge. But we have other examples, such as the electoral framework. It only took 4 years after the electoral reform to see some of the outcomes and to gain some trust. With the auditing office, it took 5 years to start seeing some outcomes. So we'll see if society is capable to wait and see the first outcomes of the new anti-corruption system.
I'm mindful of a week or so ago, we had the pleasure of hosting the commissioner for CIDE, the anti-corruption body in Guatemala, and CIDE before with great visibility, doing a prosecution last year that involved forced the resignation of the president of Guatemala. CIDE was convened in 2006, and for especially initially on, suffered through a lot of criticism before launching these sort of really history-making investigations in Guatemala.